the essence of the EU's, the journey that the EU has been on is that it is towards the new approach, the new legislative framework, where standards are used as voluntary tools supporting a performance-based regulatory framework, which is the system we have in the UK today. So with very little prescriptive regulation. So we say things like make a safe toy, or to be more precise, toys should not have a risk of strangulation. The regulation doesn't say how that may happen, but that will be set out in an industry standard, for example, how that may be done. That's not necessarily the only way to do it, but it's a way for a manufacturer to claim compliance with a regulation. They could do it some other way if they saw fit. So this approach of performance-based regulation creates a market framework where the voluntary standards provide, in some cases, a means of compliance with the regulation. The market surveillance provides a structure of post-market activity, and conformity assessment, the third leg, if you like, provides a tool for manufacturers to claim conformity with regulation. So there are three distinct spaces in this landscape. The European Union then doesn't make standards. It uses the standards made by the 34 countries of the European system. The two main European standards organisations are called CEN and CENELEC. I pay the United Kingdom, BSI pays the United Kingdom subscription to CEN and CENELEC, and indeed the third organisation, ETSI, the telecom
What's the name of that? You're mentioning the name of the standards setting organisation that we pay a subscription to and that we contribute to. What is it called?
There are three organisations in Europe that are designated as European Standardisation Organisations. The biggest one is called CEN, which is the Committee for European Normalisation. That's general standards. There's a second organisation called CENELEC, which deals primarily with electrotechnical standards. And then there's a third organisation called ETSI, which is in the telecoms area. And it's a much smaller body of work. These three European organisations mirror, in some sense, the global international organisations, ISO and IEC, and the ITU-T.
Lord Anderson.
Would you define Europe in that sense? Are there countries outside the EU which are part of this same system?
Oh yes, sir. There are 34 countries in the European industry standards system. All 34 countries are full members of that system, and they participate as they choose in the development and making of European standards, harmonised standards, including harmonised standards.
Which are the countries then outside the EU which are part of the same system?
The EFTA countries, Switzerland, Turkey, Macedonia, Serbia.
Cases that are wanting to do a lot of trading with Europe are trying to reach the same sort of standards that would be operating across.
Certainly one interpretation. The global model is to develop one standard for use everywhere. Mm-hmm. Industry is seeking one standard that is used everywhere, rather than the historic approach of multiple standards, multiple lines in factories, different sizes of this, that and the other. So the global trajectory is towards one single standard, preferably the global standard, used everywhere. The UK is top of the international league table in the participation in international European standards making, and 95% of the standards adopted by BSI as the national standards body as British national standards are international and European. We really don't make any British standards anymore because we want to write the international standards and, where appropriate, the regional standards for the European region. Some of those regional standards, the European regional standards, the ENs, are used by the European Union through the Commission as part of their policy delivery. But it's only a part of their activity.
Much, but just to be clear, the three organisations that you mentioned are not part structurally of the EU. They're separate European organisations that have 34 subscribers.
Thank you. So yes, the three European standards organisations, of which only two are really relevant to the discussion this morning, CEN and CENELEC, are private organisations with a joint back office in Brussels, but they are effectively a cooperation mechanism for the 34 members to share some functions, to cooperate. They're not part of the EU.
So my point is that Brexit won't affect our membership of those entities.
It would be nice if it were that simple. But I already tried to explain that the EU makes use of the European standardisation system of the 34 countries, and it issues requests to those organisations to develop standards to support policy delivery. So around 20% of the ENs in the end are listed as providing a presumption of conformity with some European regulation. So the European Union, the Commission, has quite a keen interest in the two private organisations, CEN and CENELEC, and the third telecoms organisation, ETSI. But they don't have any membership in sense of being on the board of those organisations. They provide some funding to those organisations, but the prime connection between the Commission and the European Standards organisations is that they grant them the exclusive role of stamping a business standard with the label EN. And once it's given the EN label, accepted by the European Standards organisations, we, 34 members, are committed to adopt and implement that standard and, critically, to withdraw any conflicting standards to ensure that we're all operating with a single standard, no barriers to trade across the 34 countries.
Michael Cashman, Lord Cashman, an opportunity, and Lord Pollack immediately afterwards.
Thank you very much. Can I perhaps sum it up in that CEN and CENELEC, the common denominator is that those 34 countries trade together, and the 6 trade within or to the 28 EU member states. So the common denominator is that they are trading together.
Yes, sir, but I think it goes way beyond that. The European standards are developed and used in many other countries. They're regarded as...
but in terms of looking at the EU and Britain's role within the EU and outside of the EU post-Brexit, I'm interested to learn that yes, they have influence beyond the 28, but the 34 are advised on these standards because they wish to operate within a single market of 28 plus 6.
The 34 countries co-create industry standards because there is a regional need for it. Their first choice, and indeed the stated position of the Commission and all of our member countries, is to write the international standard first. We don't write European standards because we think that's an advantage. We would rather write the global standard and then draw it down into Europe. Around 80...
What you're saying is that the ambition is to set the bar high enough and to actually export it worldwide, because that makes for better trading standards for everybody, because the European Union trades as a bloc with the rest of the world, and we don't want to be buying unsafe toys from China either. So you're trying to raise the bar globally, but here you are doing it and setting it to the highest standard within the European network, first and foremost.
Not necessarily. The position is that we globally operate as a very close community in the ISO world. I'm Vice President Policy of ISO, and now 164 member countries. There are 6 countries with permanent seats. So the UK, France and Germany, who are far and away biggest in the European context as well. US, China and Japan. We operate extremely closely. I know the Director of Standards of all the leading countries, and we talk frequently about our issues and our joint collaboration, either through the international organisations or bilaterally or multilaterally. And our ambition is to come to one standard. The only reason for writing a European standard is because there's some European specificity, perhaps an interest in policy, or perhaps some particular technology or issue which is not of interest to the rest of the world. We don't write European standards to make them more difficult for others. We write European standards where we have to, because we've got an industry demand to do something which is not reflected in the rest of the world.
Lord Pollock.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep this really simple. And you said it was complicated in answer to Lord Cashman. If Britain is in or out of Europe, why is it relevant to your organisation? Why can't Britain just continue its membership of your organisation, whether we're in or out?
My ambition is, my expectation is that the UK will remain a full member of CEN-CENELEC post-Brexit, because we fulfil all the obligations of membership of those two private organisations, and there's no reason that we wouldn't want to do that. To Lord Cashman's point, were we excluded from CEN-CENELEC, that would not only be damaging to them, but it would leave consumers with no voice in the European standards domain, and indeed our industries with no voice, and that would be extremely damaging.
Do you believe those two organisations want us in or want us out? Have you had discussions?
We're in the midst of discussions with individual members, which is the way it will be decided at the end.
I think my question has been beautifully lined up, which is essentially most of these discussions and most of these inquiries about Brexit, the real issue boils down to reciprocity cross-border.
That's
and what happens when the door shuts. What's the plan B? Now, refreshingly, we seem to be hearing from you that actually, perhaps I'm putting far too shiny a gloss on this, actually it's all fine because we're in CENELEC and we're going to carry on anyway. So the cliff edge, the mot du jour that one hears so much about Brexit, we're not going to have a cliff edge in standards. You're just going to continue offering protection in the same way you always have through these other bodies, or is that a grossly simplified and over-optimistic understanding?
Not at all. It is precisely about reciprocity of market access. The whole global standards industry piece, one standard used everywhere, it's all about reciprocity of market access. And within the European countries and indeed others, that is provided through the industry standards. Provided we remain a member of CEN-CENELEC, then we will immediately carry on as today, working on the European standards, influencing them for the benefit of consumers and industry. Were we not in CEN-CENELEC, then there would be quite a serious risk that our industries would be using European standards because they'd have to, but they would have had no influence over their shaping, and I mean the other 33 countries, shaping of industry standards used across the European bloc. So there's a risk of that occurring. We would have to adopt them anyway in the UK because that would be the simple thing to do.
Can I just ask two quick supplementary on that? First of all, let's just drill down on, is there any danger, and if so, out of 10, how big is it, that we won't continue membership of those bodies? And also, could you, and of course your colleague also, say a little bit about our ongoing ability to input into standards? It's fine to go on being a member and saying we'll follow the standards, but are we going to be writing those standards anymore, or just standard takers?
Well, to the second question, full member of CEN-CENELEC provides full access for UK experts to participate. The UK experts themselves have to go and participate, and it's a voluntary activity. So I have been working to maintain confidence amongst our 10,500, 11,000 UK experts who voluntarily do this, to carry on as they are, because this is the only way they will get the protections that they want. The UK consumer voice in the European system is one of the strongest in Europe, and not just from a national perspective, but also through ANEC, the European consumer body. So that is a very important dimension of making sure European standards are influenced by UK consumer interests.
Thank you.